I'd been driving the Haines Highway for about 6 weeks when it happened. That's not a long time, but it was long enough to know the road pretty well. Long enough to stop thinking about it. The job was simple. I hauled equipment and supplies up to a logging operation outside Haines, then drove the truck back empty or near empty, depending on what they needed moved. Round trips, mostly at night because the days were already getting short and the site ran early. I'd pick up a load, run it out along the Chilkat Valley, drop it, and come back. Repeat. The Haines Highway is not a complicated road. It's 2 lanes through a lot of dark trees with mountains on both sides, and the Chilkat River showing up occasionally on your left. You don't have to think much. That suited me fine. I should back up a little. I'm a fisherman. Was, mostly at that point. 11 years out of Kodiak on commercial boats. Halibut, black cod, some crab work when I could get it. I'm not great at explaining what that life is like to people who haven't done it, but the short version is that you spend a lot of time reading things. Water, weather, the way the sky looks at 4 in the morning when something's coming in from the southwest. You get used to paying attention to stuff that doesn't announce itself. That's probably the most useful thing I took off those boats. The bad season wasn't dramatic. No disaster, no injury. The fish just weren't where they were supposed to be. The quota numbers came in lower than projected, and 2 of the 3 boats I had contracts with didn't need my spot on the crew. 3rd boat was a maybe for spring. That was it. That's how it goes sometimes. I had some savings, not a lot, and a cousin in Haines I'd stayed with before. I figured I'd find something to bridge the gap until spring contracts opened up. The driving job came through a guy at the Fog Cutter Bar who knew someone at the logging company. I talked to a woman named Chelsea Lopez on the phone for about 10 minutes. She told me the pay and the schedule. I said yes. I was renting a room above the bar for $400 a month. The math worked. So that's where I was. 38 years old, temporarily a truck driver, living above a bar in Haines, Alaska, waiting for spring. Not a crisis, just a gap. The night it happened was a Wednesday, late October. I'd run a load of drill equipment up to the site that afternoon, and I was coming back empty. Maybe 9:15 at night. Dark already for hours. The heater in the cab worked fine, and I had the radio on low. Some AM station out of Juneau that kept cutting in and out. The road was dry, no ice yet, but cold enough that my breath showed when I'd stepped out to check the load straps before leaving the site. Normal night. Routine. I came around a long curve about 20 minutes south of the site, and my headlights caught him. A man standing in the middle of the road, both arms up and moving. I hit the brakes and got the truck stopped about 40 feet out. My first thought was that someone had gone off the road. It happens, especially in the dark on that stretch. And then I saw the truck in the ditch on the right shoulder. Driver's door hanging wide open, interior light on, one wheel still up on the road edge at an angle. I recognized Dalton Haines before I was even fully stopped. I'd eaten lunch with the man probably a dozen times over 6 weeks. He was the site foreman, stocky guy, reddish-gray hair going thin on top. Always wore this beat-up high-visibility jacket that had seen better days. Hard to miss. What I noticed first before anything else was that he wasn't moving like a man who'd just gone into a ditch. He was waving both arms over his head, but his feet were planted and he was facing me dead on, like he'd been standing there waiting. His truck hadn't rolled or hit anything hard. It was just off the road, nose down in the ditch. No steam, no damage I could see from where I sat. I rolled my window down. Cold air came in fast. "Dalton," I said. He got to my door in about 4 steps. Up close, he looked bad. His eyes were too wide and his hands were shaking in a way that wasn't cold. I've seen people shake from cold. That's a different thing. This was something else. "We need to go," he said. "Right now. We need to go right now, Brody." I looked past him at the tree line, just dark. Alders and spruce, same as the last 40 miles. "Get in," I said. He was around the front of the truck and in the passenger seat before I had my window back up. He pulled the door shut hard and sat there breathing through his nose, eyes forward. I'd left the truck in gear with my foot on the brake. I didn't move yet. He was wearing his insulated vest, but no jacket. It was maybe 28 degrees outside. He'd been out there without a jacket. "Dalton, drive," he said. "Please." I drove. I kept it at a reasonable speed because the road didn't forgive much, and I didn't know yet what I was dealing with. Haynes sat rigid in the passenger seat, both hands on his knees, watching the road ahead and the tree line on his side. He didn't look at me. After about 2 minutes, he said, "Don't use the radio." "Okay," I said. I didn't ask why. I figured I'd hear why. I knew the Haines city limits were about 20 minutes out at the speed I was going. I held on to that number. 20 minutes was concrete. 20 minutes was a fixed point I could drive toward while whatever this was got itself sorted out. Haynes didn't say anything for a while. I let him sit. I've spent enough time on boats with men who needed a minute to get their legs under them before they could talk. You don't push it. You just keep the boat moving and let them find their way back. When he started talking, his voice was lower than usual. Haynes normally talked like a foreman, direct, a little loud, used to being heard over equipment. This wasn't that. 3 days ago, he said, we found something. He stopped there for a second. At the site, near the preserve boundary, east side, the crew was clearing a section and they hit concrete about 4 feet down, old. Not a foundation, not a tank, something else. Underground. Had to widen the cut to get a look at it. I kept my eyes on the road. We went in, he said. Me and Martin and Wood and 2 others. There were symbols on the walls, carved in, and bones on the floor. Not scattered, arranged, like someone put them there. He said that last part carefully, like someone put them there. Martin and Wood went back the next day, he said, to get a better look. I waited. Martin came back, Haynes said. Wood didn't. I asked what happened to Wood. Haynes looked out his window at the dark tree line and said they hadn't found enough of the man to determine that. I kept driving. The heater ran. The AM station had gone to static somewhere in the last few minutes, and I hadn't noticed until just then. 20 minutes to Haynes. I kept the number in my head. I planned to pull straight up to the Alaska State Troopers post on Haynes Highway and hand all of it to whoever was behind the desk and be done with it. Haynes was still watching the trees on his side of the road. I didn't ask him anything else yet. He wasn't finished, and I could tell, and the city limits were still a fixed point up ahead somewhere in the dark. He said Martin hadn't spoken a word since the first hour after he came back out of the trees. Not a single word to anyone. Haynes said he'd tried. The other guys on the crew had tried. Martin just sat there looking at something that wasn't in the room. That part bugged me more than the rest of it, honestly. The bones and the structure and the symbols, those were bad, but they were things, objects. You can file objects away somewhere. A man going silent and staying that way, that's a different category of bad. That's something that got inside him and didn't leave. I didn't say any of that. I just drove. The highway was empty in both directions. It gets that way out here in late October. Not just quiet, actually empty, like the road exists for its own reasons and you're just using it. The headlights threw about 100 feet of visibility, and after that it was just black tree line on both sides and the occasional reflector post. I knew this stretch. I'd driven it probably 40 times in 2 months. It didn't feel the same tonight, which I noted and then set aside because there was nothing useful to do with it. Haynes had gone quiet again. He was still watching his side of the tree line, not moving his head much, just watching. I got the impression he'd been watching tree lines for 3 days straight and hadn't figured out how to stop. I thought about what he'd said about the radio. Don't use the radio. I hadn't asked him to explain that, and I still didn't. Some things you ask about and some things you just accept as a condition and keep moving. I'd learned that on boats. A deckhand tells you the starboard winch is making a noise and you believe him first and investigate second. You don't stop to debate it in the moment. 20 minutes to Haynes. Probably less now. I kept the number running in the back of my head like a countdown. I'd been doing it since he got in the truck. Troopers post on the highway, pull in, park, walk inside. Hand the whole thing to whoever was behind the desk. That was the plan. It was a good plan. Simple plans usually are. Then the engine stopped. No cough, no warning light, no RPM drop I could feel through the pedal. It was just there, and then it wasn't. The dashboard went dark. The heater fan wound down. The headlights stayed on for about 3 seconds, and then those went too. And then it was just the truck coasting forward in the dark on whatever momentum I had left. I steered to the shoulder and let it roll to a stop. Gravel under the tires. Then nothing. I sat there for a second. I'm not sure what I was waiting for. Some follow-up, some explanation from the truck itself. There wasn't one. I turned the key. The ignition made a small, dead click, and that was it. I tried it again. Same click. No crank, no attempt, nothing. "Don't," Haynes said. "I'm just trying the ignition." "I know. Stop." I stopped. I looked at him. He was still facing forward, hands on his knees, not looking at me. I checked my phone. 1 bar, then none. Then the little searching indicator spinning in the corner. I held it up toward the windshield like that ever actually helps. It didn't help. No signal. Okay. So, truck dead on the shoulder of the Haynes Highway at somewhere around 10 at night. No cell service. 20 minutes from town by driving, which was now not an option. I did a quick inventory of what I had. The flashlight was in the door pocket on my side. A good one, a streamlight I'd had for years. There was a wool blanket behind the seat, a half-empty water bottle in the cup holder. I was dressed for the weather. Haynes was dressed for the weather. If it came to walking out, we could walk out. It was cold, but it wasn't dangerous cold, not yet. I grabbed the flashlight and pushed my door open. "Brody." Haynes's hand came across the cab and grabbed my forearm. Not hard, but firm. He was looking at me now. "Don't open the hood," he said. "I just want to see if it's something simple." "It's not something simple." He said it like he already knew. "And the hood makes noise. The latch don't." I looked at him. His face in the dark cab was just shapes, but his eyes were steady, not panicked. He'd moved past panic at some point in the last 3 days and landed somewhere quieter and worse than panic. I pulled my door shut. Didn't latch it all the way, just pulled it to. I don't know why. Some instinct about not making noise. We sat there. The truck ticked as the engine cooled. Outside, the wind was moving through the alders along the shoulder. That dry October rattle of branches with no leaves left on them. I know that sound. I'd heard it every night for 2 months driving this road. This wasn't that. It started maybe 30 yards back from the truck, off the right shoulder, back in the tree line where the alders get thick before the spruce takes over. Something moving, heavy enough that I could hear the ground in it. Not just branches, but weight on the earth, compressed and deliberate. It was low, and it was fast, which didn't match the weight of it. Those two things don't usually go together. I've spent a lot of time around animals. Brown bear, black bear, moose, all of it. On water and on land both. I know what a large animal sounds like moving through brush at night. I know the rhythm of it, the way it pauses, the way it breathes. This wasn't a pattern I had a file for. It was rhythmic in a way that felt intentional, like something that knew exactly where it was going. It was getting closer. I got back in the truck. I was already in the truck, but I pulled the door fully shut and hit the lock. Haynes hit his side without me saying anything. The 2 locks clicked in the same second. We didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say. I kept the flashlight in my hand, but I didn't turn it on. The movement stopped, just like that. Mid-stride or whatever passed for a stride out there. 1 second it was coming, and then it wasn't. The alders went quiet. The spruce went quiet. Everything went quiet in a way that felt less like silence and more like something holding its breath. I've been on the water in dead calm conditions. That specific kind of flat where the surface looks painted and there's no wind, and even the boat seems to stop creaking. Most people think that's peaceful. It isn't. It's the ocean waiting. This was the same feeling. The quiet wasn't empty. It had weight to it. Haynes was breathing through his nose, short and controlled, like he was trying to take up less air. I could hear my own pulse in my ears. I was aware of the vinyl on the seat, the way my jacket was bunched at the shoulder, the fact that the flashlight in my hand was getting warm from my grip. Small stuff. The kind of thing you notice when your brain is running out of bigger things to process. Neither of us moved. I watched the tree line. I couldn't see anything. The headlights were off. They'd cut when the engine died, and the moon wasn't doing much through the cloud cover. Just dark shapes, spruce and alder, and the pale line of the road shoulder and nothing else. I stared at it anyway. I don't know what I was looking for. Movement, I guess. Or the absence of it. Some confirmation that whatever was out there had actually stopped and wasn't just standing still at the edge of the light. 3 minutes is a long time to sit without talking. I know because I counted. Not out loud, just in my head. I got to somewhere around 180 and then I lost track and started over. Haynes didn't say anything. I didn't say anything. There wasn't a version of that conversation that helped. At some point I realized I'd been holding the flashlight so hard my fingers were going numb. I loosened my grip a little. That was the most I moved for a while. Then the headlights came on. Both of them at the same time. Full brightness. No flicker. No warm-up. Just dark, and then lit up like nothing had happened. I looked at the ignition. The key was in it, but I hadn't turned it. I looked down at my hands. Both of them were flat on my thighs, palms down. I hadn't moved them. I was sure of that the way you're sure of what your own hands are doing. I hadn't touched the steering wheel. I hadn't touched the key. I hadn't touched anything. The engine turned over. Clean start. No hesitation, like it had been running the whole time. Haynes made a sound, not a word, just a short exhale through his teeth. That was it. I didn't sit there thinking about it. I put the truck in gear and I drove. I pushed it harder than I should have on that road. The Haynes Highway through the Chilkat Valley isn't a straight shot. There are curves and the shoulder drops off in places, and in late October, you can get ice on the pavement without any warning. I knew all of that. I drove fast anyway. I kept my eyes on the road and not on the mirrors and not on the tree line. And I didn't let myself think about what had just happened with the ignition. That was a problem for later. Right now the problem was distance, and I was solving it. Haynes didn't ask me to slow down. He had one hand braced on the dash, and he was watching the road the same way I was. We didn't talk for the first 10 minutes. Then he said, "Don't use the radio." And I said, "I know." And that was the whole conversation. The Chilkat Valley opened up a little as we got closer to town. The mountains were still there on both sides, but the valley floor widened and the trees thinned, and I started seeing the occasional light from a structure set back off the road. A barn. A house with one window lit. Normal things. I kept driving. The ferry terminal is on the north end of Haynes, right where the road comes in off the highway. I saw the lights of town before I got there, just the low glow of it against the cloud cover, and I felt something in my chest ease about 2%. Not relief exactly, more like the difference between a situation that's completely out of control and one that's only mostly out of control. That's when the lights came on behind me, blue and red in the mirrors, and the short blast of a siren. State Trooper. I recognized the vehicle, that dark gray Ford with the yellow stripe. I pulled over immediately. Didn't hesitate. I put it in park, turned the engine off, and got out with both hands where he could see them. I didn't reach for anything. I just stood next to the truck with my hands up and waited. The trooper came up with a flashlight on me. Tall guy, solid, short, dark hair. He had the cold weather layer on over his uniform, and his hand wasn't on his weapon, but it wasn't far from it either. "Sir?" he said. "My name's Brody Hall," I said. "I drive supply for the logging operation out of the Chilkat site. The man in the passenger seat is Dalton Haynes. He's the site foreman. We need to talk to someone." He looked at me for a second. Then he looked at Haynes through the windshield. Then back at me. "What's the nature of the situation?" he said. So I told him. Standing on the shoulder of the Haynes Highway, at whatever time it was, close to midnight, I think, with the cold coming off the mountains and my breath showing in the flashlight beam, I told him about the engine cutting out, about the sounds in the alders, about the ignition. I told him about Bradley Wood. I told him about the structure the crew had found near the preserve boundary. I told him about Jonathan Martin not talking. He listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't write anything down yet, just listened with that specific flat expression that law enforcement people practice. When I finished, he said, "Stay here," and walked back to his vehicle. I stood by the hood. Haynes had gotten out at some point and was standing a few feet away, hands in his jacket pockets. He was looking at the pavement. The trooper was in his vehicle for a few minutes. I could see him on the radio. Then he got out and came back. "Search and rescue went out to the logging site earlier this evening," he said. "They located the structure." He paused. "They also located Bradley Wood." I waited for the rest of it. He looked at me and then at Haynes and then back at me. "Details about the scene aren't being released," he said. "What I can tell you is that you're not to return to that site. Either of you, under any circumstances." "Understood," I said. He nodded once. His name tag said Hughes. Garrett Hughes. "I'm going to need you both to come in," he said. Haynes went with a paramedic unit that showed up maybe 10 minutes after Hughes made his call. I didn't see them arrive. 1 minute Haynes was standing near the shoulder, and the next there were 2 people in jackets walking him toward a vehicle with its side door open. He didn't look back. I watched him go, and then looked at the road for a while. Hughes told me to follow him in my truck. I did. The trooper post was a squat building off Haynes Highway near the edge of town. Tan siding, fluorescent lights inside, a bulletin board by the front desk with some laminated notices pinned to it. It smelled like burned coffee and carpet cleaner. There was a space heater running somewhere that I could hear, but not see. Hughes pointed me toward a chair at a table in a side room, and I sat down. The chair was plastic, the kind with metal legs that scrape when you move them. I tried not to move it much. A second officer came in about 5 minutes later. Deputy Oscar Santiago. He introduced himself, shook my hand, and sat across from me with a notepad already open. He had a mechanical pencil. He clicked it once and wrote the date at the top of the page. That was it for preamble. Hughes asked most of the questions. Santiago wrote. I went through the whole thing again. The figure in the road. Haynes waving. The truck in the ditch. Getting him into the cab. What he told me about the structure, the bones, the symbols. Martin and Wood going back in. What happened to Wood? The engine cutting out. The sound in the alders. The 3 minutes sitting still with the doors locked. The headlights coming on. The engine turning over. I said that last part twice because Hughes asked me to repeat it. I told him both my hands were on my thighs when the engine started. I told him I was certain of that. He nodded and didn't say anything, and looked at Santiago, who was writing. That was the part I kept expecting questions about. The headlights, the ignition, some version of, "Are you sure? Or could you have accidentally, or maybe you were disoriented?" Nothing. Hughes just nodded and moved on to the next thing. Santiago kept writing. I'm not a person who reads a lot into things. That's probably a fishing habit. You watch the water, you watch the sky, you call what you see, and you don't add to it. But the absence of questions from Santiago was its own kind of thing. He wasn't confused by what I was telling him. He He wasn't skeptical. He was just writing it down, steady and unhurried, like a man transcribing a document he'd already read. That part stuck with me more than I let on. We went through it a third time around midnight. Hughes asked me to walk back through the timeline from when I first spotted Haynes in the road. I did. Santiago wrote. At some point, someone put a paper cup of coffee on the table near my elbow. I drank it. It tasted like it had been sitting on a burner since around noon. The second time, through the part about the sound in the trees, Hughes asked me to describe the movement. I told him it was heavy, low, and fast. He asked if I could estimate size from the sound. I told him I couldn't. I told him it moved the way something moves when it isn't worried about being heard, and then it stopped. And the stopping was cleaner than any animal I'd been around. He wrote something down himself at that point, which he hadn't done before. I noticed that too. Just past 2 in the morning, Hughes told me I was free to go. He handed me a card with a case number on it. He said someone might follow up in the next few days and asked me not to leave the area without letting them know. I said I understood. Santiago closed his notepad and stood up and shook my hand again. Neither of them said anything else. I walked out through the front of the building. The cold hit me right away. My truck was in the small lot out front, right where I'd left it. I stood next to it for a second before I got in. I put the key in. It started on the first turn. No hesitation, no strangeness, nothing. Just the engine catching and the dash lights coming up like any other night. The fuel gauge read 3/4. The heater kicked in after about a minute. I sat there with my hands on the wheel and let it run. I drove to my rental on Main Street. It was above the Fog Cutter Bar, which was closed at that hour. The bar sign was still lit though, that orange neon, and it threw a little color up the outside staircase. I went up, unlocked the door, went inside, and turned on every light in the room. The overhead, the lamp on the nightstand, the light above the bathroom sink. I left the bathroom door open so that one counted too. I sat on the edge of the bed. The room was small. Wood-paneled walls, a window that looked out over Main Street, a dresser with a water ring on top from someone else's glass. There was a Kenai River calendar on the wall from 2 years ago, still open to July. I looked at it for a while. I didn't sleep. I called the logging company at 8 the next morning. Chelsea Lopez answered on the second ring. I told her I was done, that I was calling to resign the contract, and that she could mail the last check to my Kodiak address. She said, "The site's closed indefinitely." I said, "Okay." She said, "We're in the process of notifying all contractors." Her voice was flat in a specific way, not unfriendly, just stripped of everything except the words themselves. I'd heard that tone before, usually from people who'd been told something they couldn't do anything about and had decided the only way through it was to just keep talking in complete sentences. She knew more than she was saying. That was obvious. I didn't push it. I asked about Martin. She said he'd been airlifted to Anchorage. She didn't say when, didn't say which facility, didn't say anything else about it. I thanked her and hung up. I found out later through Haynes that Martin still hadn't said a word. Not to the medics, not to whoever they handed him off to in Anchorage, not to anyone. Haynes told me that in a short text about a week after everything happened. He said Martin was somewhere receiving care, and that was all he knew. Haynes quit that same week. He didn't tell me where he was going. The structure near the preserve boundary got cordoned off within a few days. I know that because I drove past the logging site access road once before I left town, not to go in, just passing. There were vehicles parked at the turnoff. No agency markings I recognized. No state trooper vehicles, no Forest Service. Nothing with a logo I could place. Just a couple of dark SUVs and 2 men standing near the gate in plain jackets. One of them watched my truck as I went by. I didn't slow down. I didn't know who they were. I still don't. I boarded the ferry on a Sunday morning. The MV Tazlina, which is one of the smaller state ferries, not the big ones that run the full southeast route. It was cold enough that my breath showed and the dock planks had a thin frost on them I had to watch for. I had one bag. I'd left most of what I'd accumulated in the rental room. Some canned food, a pair of work gloves, a wool blanket I'd bought at the hardware store on 2nd Street. I didn't want to pack carefully. I just wanted to go. The terminal at Haines is small. A waiting room with plastic chairs and a vending machine that only had 2 things left in it. I sat there for about 40 minutes before boarding opened, drinking bad coffee from a paper cup I'd brought from the fog cutter, reading the same paragraph of a Field and Stream magazine from 2 years ago, over and over, without retaining any of it. There was a family with 2 kids across the room. A guy my age in a Carhartt jacket sleeping upright with his arms crossed. Nobody was talking. That was fine. I got on, found the rear deck, and sat down. The rear deck on the Tazalina is just a covered outdoor section with bench seating and a railing. It smells like diesel and salt and whatever the last group of passengers left behind, which in this case was cigarette smoke. I didn't mind. I'd spent 11 years on working boats. That smell meant something was moving. Haines dropped away behind us. The mountains came up on both sides of the Lynn Canal as we headed south. The Chilkat Range on one side, the Takshanuk on the other. I know those names because I'd looked at maps when I first took the driving job, trying to get a sense of where I was. I'm not from Alaska originally. I came up from Astoria for the fishing work and just never left. But I'd never spent much time in the southeast before. The Lynn Canal is different from what I knew around Kodiak. Narrower, the mountains closer. The whole thing feels more like a corridor than open water. I watched Haines get small. The ferry terminal, the cannery buildings, the white spire of the church up on the hill. The fog cutter was somewhere in there, but I couldn't pick it out at this distance. The town just compressed into a cluster of shapes, and then the shapes got harder to read, and then it was mostly just the mountains behind it. I kept watching longer than made sense. The thing I kept coming back to was the ignition. Not the sound in the trees, not Haines's face, not any of the other parts I'd spent 4 days turning over. The ignition, specifically the engine catching without me touching anything. I'd been sitting there with both hands flat on my thighs. I remember that clearly because I'd put them there deliberately, trying not to do anything sudden, trying to stay still, and the engine just turned over. The headlights came on first, then the engine. I didn't touch the key. I didn't touch anything. I know what my hands do. That sounds like a strange thing to be certain about, but it's not. Not if you've spent enough time doing work where your hands matter. On a boat, you develop a pretty specific awareness of where your hands are and what they're doing at any given moment. You have to. The wrong grip at the wrong moment, a line wrapped around your wrist when you shouldn't have let it, fingers near a winch drum. You learn to track that stuff without thinking about it. It becomes automatic. So when I say, I know my hands were on my thighs and not on the ignition, I'm not guessing. I'm not misremembering. I know. The engine started. I didn't start it. Something in those trees did. Or decided to, anyway. Which is the part that doesn't sit still when I try to think about it directly. It's not just that something started the truck. It's that starting the truck was a choice. It let us leave. Whatever was out there in the alders, moving through the dark in a way I couldn't account for, it decided at some point that we were going to go. And we went. I've tried to come up with other explanations. Some kind of electrical fault that happened to resolve itself at exactly that moment. A coincidence of timing. I'm not a mechanic, but I drove that truck for 6 weeks without a single issue before or after. And the shop in Haines checked it over after the trooper released it and found nothing wrong. Nothing. The guy at the shop shrugged and said, sometimes these things sort themselves out. I didn't push it. The mountains behind Haines were still visible, but they'd gone pale. Just a line of white and gray at the horizon, the peaks losing definition against the sky. The Lynn Canal spread out around the ferry on both sides, flat and dark, the color of old pewter. There were a few whitecaps further out where the wind was working the water. Not rough, just alive. I thought about why. I couldn't help it. I'd been trying not to think about why for 4 days and it hadn't worked. So I just let myself sit with it for a while. Why let us leave? Why that moment? Why us? Why not earlier or later, or not at all? I didn't have anything. I don't have anything now. There's no answer I can construct that holds together, because I don't know what was out there. And without knowing that I can't know anything about what it wanted or didn't want, or whether those are even the right words for it. Wanted, decided. I'm using human words for something I have no framework for. That's the part I'll carry, I think. Not the sound, not what Hughes told us about Wood, or what was left of Martin, or the men in plain jackets at the gate who watched my truck go by. All of that is bad. All of that will probably surface at 3 in the morning for a long time. But the thing underneath all of it, the thing I can't put down, is that something made a choice about us and we had no part in it. We were just there. Whatever the reason was, if there was one. It had nothing to do with me or Haynes or anything we did or didn't do. We didn't earn it. We didn't negotiate it. Something decided, and we left, and we'll never know why. I'm not sure what to do with that. I haven't figured it out yet. The pale line of mountains behind Haynes thinned out, and then it was gone. Just water behind the ferry now, and the wake cutting back through it, white and churned and already settling flat again, 20 yards out. The Lynn Canal opened up around us. The sky was low and gray and even in all directions. I kept watching the water where the mountains had been. There was nothing there. Just the canal and the cold coming off it and the sound of the engine below decks doing its work. I pulled my jacket tighter and stayed where I was. The ferry had a small, covered section near the stern, a bench bolted to the wall under an overhang with a heater mounted above it that worked about 60% of the time. I'd been out on the open deck long enough that my hands were stiff, so I moved in there for a while. The heater was doing its thing. I sat with my elbows on my knees and stared at the deck plating. There was a family a few rows up, 2 kids, a woman in a red parka, a man who kept checking his phone even though there was no signal out here. I watched them for a minute. The older kid was drawing something in a small notebook. The younger one was asleep across the bench with her head in the woman's lap. Normal stuff. I looked away. I'd been turning the same thing over since the highway, and I was tired of it. But I couldn't stop. That's the honest version. It wasn't like I was choosing to sit with it. It just kept coming back around. The same specific moment, every time. The headlights. The engine. My hands on my thighs. I know what my hands were doing because I was watching them. I'd pressed them flat on purpose, like keeping still was going to help anything. And then the truck just started. No key, no ignition. Nothing from me. It started and the lights came on and we drove to Haynes, and that was it. I've spent 11 years on boats. You learn pretty fast what you can trust and what you can't. And a big part of that is knowing the difference between what actually happened and what you think happened because you were scared. Fear does things to memory. I know that. But I also know what my hands were doing, and they were not touching the ignition. That's not fear. That's just a fact, same as a barometric reading or a tide chart. It happened the way it happened. Something out there made a decision about us. That's the part I can't put down. Not the sound in the alders. I've heard things in the dark that I couldn't explain and moved on from them. Not Bradley Wood or what was left of him, which I only knew about secondhand anyway, passed along in the flat, careful language of people who'd already decided not to say more than they had to. I can file those things somewhere. They're awful, but they have a shape. This doesn't have a shape. Something decided to let us go. It didn't have to. We were sitting in a dead truck on a dark road 20 minutes from town, and it could have done whatever it wanted with us, and there was nothing we could have done about that. But it didn't. It started the truck and it let us drive away, and I have no idea why. I didn't earn that. Haynes didn't earn it. We didn't do anything smart or brave or right. We just sat there with our hands in our laps and it let us leave. The why of that is not something I'm going to get to. I've accepted that. I don't mean I've made peace with it. I'm not sure that's available to me. But I understand it the way I understand that some weather systems don't behave the way the models say they should. You note it. You work around it. You don't get an explanation. The heater clicked off. I waited to see if it would come back on. It didn't. I stayed where I was anyway. I thought about Haynes for a minute. Last I'd heard, he was back in Juneau staying with his brother. He'd sent me a text about a week after everything. Just said he was doing okay. Asked how I was. I wrote back that I was fine. He said good. That was the whole conversation. I didn't expect we'd talk much after that. We weren't close before any of this happened, and I don't think going through something like that automatically makes people close. Sometimes it just makes them two people who want to stop thinking about the same thing. Martin was still in Anchorage. Still not talking, as far as I knew. I thought about him sometimes. What he saw when he went back to that structure. What he came out carrying that took his words away. I hoped it got better for him. I didn't know if it would. The family up ahead started packing their stuff. The man got the sleeping kid up onto his shoulder, and she barely woke. They moved inside toward the main cabin. The older one with the notebook looked back at me once on the way out. I nodded. She didn't react. Then they were gone. I was the only one left in the covered section. I went back out to the open deck after a while. The cold was sharper now, the canal wider. The mountains on both sides were dark shapes against a darker sky, no detail to them, just mass. The water was gray and flat, and it went a long way in every direction. I stood at the rail and held on and watched it. I've spent most of my adult life on water. I'm comfortable with how indifferent it is. It doesn't care about you, doesn't wish you well or ill. It just does what it does according to forces that have nothing to do with whether you're on it. I've always found that straightforward, honest almost. You know where you stand. This was different. Or maybe it wasn't. Maybe that's the thing. Maybe whatever was in those trees operates the same way. Not cruel, not merciful, just doing what it does, according to reasons I don't have access to. And the fact that we walked away from it doesn't mean it had anything to do with us, any more than surviving a bad crossing means the ocean decided to spare you. It just means the variables lined up that way. It means we were there at the right time for whatever its purposes were, and then we weren't needed anymore and it moved on. I don't know if that's better or worse than the alternative being that it made a real choice, that it looked at us and decided something specific about us, that there was a reason with our names in it. I think I prefer the indifferent version. I think that one's easier to live with. The ferry's wake ran out behind us, white and churned up and already smoothing over. 20 yards back, it was flat again. 30 yards back, you couldn't tell a boat had passed. The canal didn't hold the shape of anything that moved through it. I stayed at the rail for a long time. Long enough that my face went numb and I stopped noticing the cold. The lights of a small town passed on the eastern shore. I didn't know which one. Some cluster of buildings and a dock, a few lit windows. Gone in a couple minutes. I wasn't going back to Haynes, I knew that. I'd figure out the next thing when I got to Juneau. There were boats. There was always work if you knew what you were doing and weren't too proud about the terms. I'd done it before. I'd find a crew or I'd find a contract and I'd get back on the water, and after a while the days would fill up with the right kinds of problems, the ones with answers. I was okay with that. That was enough. The Lynn Canal stretched out ahead of the boat, wide and dark and going south. I kept my hands on the rail and watched it come.